first, this is consistent with what the American president has been asking in terms of Europe coming up and stepping up to the plate in terms of defense spending. But second, and I think you raise a really good point, that there's an opportunity here for critical supply chains, for defense, for the United States and Europe to work more cooperatively and collaboratively together on some of these really important supply chains. And so depending on how this is executed, there could be some opportunities for American defense firms to play into this as well.
Really? Can we trust the Americans, frankly, given what's happened with the Transatlantic Alliance? Are we in a position to be continuing to embed US technology into our defense systems longer term?
Yeah, I think I would push back a bit on the premise that there is a rift in the transatlantic relationship. I mean, clearly what happened on Friday with the President Trump and Zelensky meeting playing out in public was quite stunning to watch. But I worked very closely with President Trump and a number of world leaders in the first administration, and some of those conversations and the intensity are not uncommon, right? These are like incredibly high stakes issues that world leaders are discussing. I think what was unique about it was the fact that it did play out so publicly. Normally, cameras aren't there for those types of conversations.
This is a US that's siding with Moscow. We saw that at the United Nations, and we see a president who has long had sympathy with Putin. This isn't just a one-day affair.
I do push back on that because I think what triggered some of the reaction in the room on Friday was a question by a reporter along this lines of, Mr. President, are you siding with Putin now? Is that what we can assess from these comments? And the politics on this are very different in the United States than they are in Europe. The politics are 73% of Americans want to see this war come to an end as soon as humanly possible. And President Trump is a consummate deal maker, and his view is that if I'm out there criticizing Putin, calling him the villain and saying all these horrible things about Russia, all of which may be true, I may win the moral high ground, but we're going to lose the war. And so I think he's trying to take a step closer in terms of rhetoric to Russia in order to try to bridge these two leaders together who clearly hate each other. And obviously, Zelensky has very good reason to hate Vladimir Putin. Nevertheless, his point is that that's not going to create a deal. And so that's some of the dynamic you're seeing. And I think you're seeing Prime Minister Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, the Prime Minister of Italy, and others trying to be that bridge and keeping the United States and Europe together. So I don't think this is a fracturing of the transatlantic relationship in the way that others over here may perceive it. I actually think that both the United States and Europe are continuing to row in the same direction on this.
Okay. In terms of the UK then, I wonder what your perspective is on that. I mean, Keir Starmer did have a reasonable meeting, at least it was taken quite positively in the UK, but the government here, the meeting between Starmer and Trump. The UK may avoid tariffs. The focus perhaps for the US administration may be more on the EU, although not in today's volley of tariffs. Do you think the UK can avoid tariffs, and does it do that basically at the expense of doing a deal when it comes to a US-UK trade negotiation that then goes in the US's favour? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah. What I would say is that during that press conference, President Trump joked with Prime Minister Starmer that they had talked about tariffs but had come to no decision on it. But they did announce that there was going to be a US-UK trade deal or commercial deal of sorts, which the two are working out in short order. I do think that the administration looks at the UK as a country that is relatively balanced with the U.S. in terms of the trade deficit, level of tariffs. But there will certainly be asks on the U.S. side of many of the U.S. trading partners. And so we'll have to see how that shakes out.
And one question. I wonder what your thinking is on the short term versus the long term. The short term demands from the US are starting to stack up against a lot of different countries on a lot of different issues, from migrants to drugs to the trade deficits. They are big asks, and they will require a lot of other countries to make significant concessions to the US. That's not a long-term strategy, is it, from the Trump White House to ask for concessions repeatedly? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that a second Trump administration is about long-term and systemic change to the entire global trading system. President Trump only has about 3 3/4 of a year left to do it in his second term. And so he is making these huge asks of a number of trading partners. But I think he's also fully aware that this will be a negotiation, and there will be asks on the part of U.S. trading partners as well. And in an ideal negotiation, both sides end up better off at the end of of the day. So we'll have to see where all of this lands. I obviously don't speak for the administration anymore, but that said, we'll have to see.
Even if they sign a deal, you can make an argument that you can't trust that deal because the deal was signed with Mexico and Canada. I believe you were part of that deal. That deal's falling apart right before our eyes. If the US signs a deal under the Trump administration, what value is there in that deal?
Yeah, and I think there are two different types of tariffs from the perspective of the Trump administration. So the Trump administration officials have been out there messaging that this is not a trade war, this is a drug war, talking about the fact that the Trump...
There's no drugs crossing the Canadian... There's like, a couple of handfuls of fentanyl crossing the Canadian border.
But it's still a challenge. It's still an issue. Fentanyl is a number one killer of Americans between the ages of 18 and 45.
That's a massive issue.
Right. And so the point is the U.S. and Canada share the longest border in the entire world. There are 150 ports of entry, and fentanyl is still coming in through the northern border, in part through coordination with Mexican cartels. So that is part of the challenge the administration is trying to address. And I'm not in those negotiations over immigration issues, but that's the message coming out of the White House, is that we need to stem the flow of this, and then those tariffs go away.
In terms of the impact on the United States, is the Trump White House underestimating the impact that tariffs will have domestically on the US? We are already, and other policies, for example, DOGE cuts to federal workers starting to affect and flow into the US economy. Would that cause a change of heart?
Yeah, I think what you hear coming out of the White House when they're asked about the impact of tariffs, aren't these inflationary? Doesn't it add to increased prices? Their response is to say you have to look at the entirety of our economic package, which includes tax cuts, deregulation, energy diversity, and tariffs. And you can't cherry pick out one aspect and then jump to conclusions about what that means. You have to look at the entire package. But of course, we'll see how this plays out, right? We'll see how these policies are actually implemented and what it means for companies, what it means for everyday Americans, frankly, what it means for the price of eggs, which has a lot to do with American politics.